Dr. Rana Bhattacharya, and sir was telling me, he has sent me a introductory slide for Rana. I don't know. There are so many things to talk about Rana. Very good cricketer. I don't know how many of you know that. And he's currently assistant professor of our Department of Endocrinology. He is the one who actually shoulders the responsibility of the RIA lab that we run in IPGMER Hospital. One of the key components and key member of team IPGMER Endocrinology, without whom we will probably not be able to run academics of our institute. And Rana has done his DM. In fact, he stood first in his DM exams of his batch. He's done his MRCP, FICP, FACE, and he's won also several awards, including the Anil Sheth Award. He won the Best Poster Award from RSSDI, if I remember correctly, for his own DM dissertation. So I can go on talking about Rana for ages perhaps, but let's get back to today's program. And I think one of the key things that students need to know is about, in exams, you will be asked about certain cases. So in endocrinology, a case of thyromegaly might be given in the section of spot cases. Now, therefore, I would hope that Rana would actually, in his deliberation, try to highlight all of those aspects that a clinician and an MD student needs to know when a case of thyromegaly is given to him or her in the exams. That's the first priority. But we all know that there's something beyond exams. You will actually have to see patients. You will actually have to treat them. So without too much of theoretical discussion, Rana, I'm sure, will do an excellent job in terms of looking at the practical aspects of examination, evaluation, and management of a patient with thyromegaly. Because after all, medicine is a vocational science. We can read so many things about pathogenesis. Ultimately, we'll have to deliver care to the patient. So what we had discussed was Rana would probably present a PPT for about 45-50 minutes at the most. And thereafter, we would be taking questions. And I would request all participants to keep on entering their questions in the chat box section so that it helps me to actually choose out the ones which are clinically relevant and important for everyone to know. So without any further ado, Dr. Rana Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Sujata. Thank you for a kind introduction. Thank you so much. A very sincere thanks to Professor M.K. Rai for arranging this and inviting me for such a wonderful clinical topic. And I love clinical teaching. So that is, I'm really grateful to the whole API team, which behind this kind of program, which is particularly targeted to the postgraduate trainees. But in the meantime, during discussion, I will also, I have planned to touch upon some point which will possibly be beneficial for the clinicians also and the teachers who are there. Some are in this group are my teachers also. So it's a very proud privilege for me. So a very good morning to all of the participants, the seniors, friends, and students. So my agenda, I will basically focus on definitely the history taking and clinical examination of thyroid gland. And I will just, it's very difficult to demonstrate procedures over a webcast, but I have kept as much pictures and some of the videos as possible to convey the way the examination should be done, particularly during the exam. And I will also, at the end, will just highlight what are the clinical investigations and what are needed. I won't go into detail of any clinical investigation, just one slide, but how you'll plan your clinical investigation depending on your input from your history taking and examination. So thyroid enlargement, which is otherwise known as goiter, can be classified into two broad ways. Number one, the structural classification, that is either a goiter is diffuse or the goiter can be nodular. And the nodular goiter can be solitary, there can be single nodule, and there is multinodular goiter. Now, if you compare between the clinical examination and investigation, the special investigation like ultrasound, obviously there will be some discrepancies. Like in clinical examination, you may feel it's a solitary goiter, but on ultrasound, you may find additional goiters, additional nodules as well. But for clinical purpose, this classification remains very, very important. There is another kind of classification that depends on the functional status. Now, both of the classifications are very important when you plan further investigation and management for a particular patient. That classification is actually divided. You can divide the patients into the euthyroid goiter, as a hyperthyroid goiter, or in some cases, goiter with thyrotoxicosis without hyperthyroid. And the third category is hypothyroid, the goiter with hypothyroidism. Now, whenever you see a goiter, please remember about 3 C's. There are 3 major concerns when you deal with a goiter. Number 1, carcinoma, whether there is an increased chance of carcinoma to a particular goiter or not. That can be elucidated from your history taking and clinical examination. Number 2, and third, whether it is of cosmetic concern to a particular patient or not. So our further management depends on these 3 concerns. But please remember, the functional status of thyroid, as I've said, has also a very important role. So with these things in the background, let's start with the proper history taking. Now, what points of the history should be taken within a short span of time? First, the age of the patient. Why it's important? Of course, the age of the patient, it determines what kind of possible thyroid disease the patient is having. As for example, a goiter in a very young age, there is of course a high chance of congenital goiter, and one of the few important causes may be in a very neonatal period, it can be due to maternal thyroid exposure. In an early childhood, it can be due to congenital goiter, and in peripubertal period, it can be due to the so-called pubertal goiter, although the term is controversial nowadays. But when we address our concern regarding malignancy, if a nodule is found in a child who is less than 14 years of age, or a person who is more than 70 years of age, the chance of malignancy increases. Although the universal iodination status is now achieved to a great extent, but still some areas, particularly in the foothills of Himalayas, there are some areas where there can be still, the areas can be iodine deficient. So the address is also important. Although, let me reassure you, as Sujata will also agree, we did a survey of 1.5 years back on World Thyroid Day, that the patients attending our OPD, the iodine status was measured, and it was found that almost all the patients are either iodine sufficient or very mildly deficient. So iodine deficiency is no more a big problem around, in our places surrounding Kolkata, but in other places, like as I've said, there can be some areas which may be deficient in soil iodine. Now, regarding the diet, of course, goitrogen is one of the thing possibly I think is a bit overhyped. If you talk about the various goitrogens, there can be various classes. I won't go into the theories of those, but the most important ones possibly the cruciferous vegetables like cabbage, cauliflower, and so on and so forth. And your patient will often ask that whether this goiter is due to the goitrogen or not. But please remember, this group of goitrogens actually contains limarin, which is converted to thiocyanate, which impairs the thyroid iodine uptake within the thyroid gland, and this conversion is mediated by an enzyme known as myrosinase. Now, myrosinase is destroyed during cooking. So unless you eat a large amount of raw cauliflower or raw cabbage, which I think nobody does. Uh, these agents do not act as goitrogen. The other agents also, like soybean or millet, a very large amount needed to be consumed, and that too with areas where the iodine sufficiency is somewhat borderline, because as I have said, these agents competes with the uptake of iodine. So if the iodine is sufficient, these agents do not cannot prevent the entry of iodine. So this is one of the important aspects, that goitrogens possibly is the relatively less important one nowadays. It's very important to have a proper family history of either benign or malignant thyroid disease. Some benign disease like Hashimoto's thyroiditis can have more increased propensity. I mean, if the person has a family history of that disease, or some malignant condition like some form of medullary thyroid carcinoma particularly, and some forms of PTC also can have familial predisposition. History of head and neck irradiation increases the chance of malignancy of thyroid. So this is a very important history that should be taken. How the goiter is noticed. Now it's a very practical thing that often we see a relatively large sized goiter which is noticed relatively recently. That can be because of two reasons. Number one, the goiter itself is of short duration. That is a very alarming kind of thing. Or sometimes the patient do not notice due to very gradual enlargement, and sometimes it's noticed by physician or friends and relatives. So it's very important to know how is the onset, when was the onset of the goiter, and how it was detected. If it is detected by the friends and relatives or doctors, possibly it's long standing, but if it is noticed by the patients, many a times, there are exceptions that it is usually short acting. Similar about progression, the patient noticed that the goiter size was small initially and is rapidly progressing, we have a great concern. Like I can give you an example. Say anaplastic thyroid carcinoma is one of the dangerous condition, can grows within weeks to even days, and it's a cause of major concern. Sometimes there is a small goiter of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, say, which is present since last 4 or 5 years, and then there is sudden enlargement. We always think about lymphoma, thyroid lymphoma in this background. So it's very important to have a history of onset and progression of the disease. Whether there is pain or not is also important. The most of the thyroid swellings are usually painless. Malignancy of thyroid disease is usually painless. But when pain is there, usually we suspect subacute thyroiditis, sometimes acute thyroiditis, which can be caused by bacterial infection. And in our experience, we have seen in some patients with tuberculosis can present with the acute onset pain and swelling. But a hemorrhage within a nodule can also present with pain, can also occur in a anaplastic thyroid carcinoma, and sometimes lymphoma also, due to rapid enlargement in these two conditions. History of fever is important. It's usually present in acute as well as more commonly possibly subacute thyroiditis. In many subacute thyroiditis, there may not be thyroid enlargement, but in some cases, there is a small enlargement of thyroid gland, which can be associated with fever. And in the same context, I will just highlight for the clinicians that in the differential of fever of unknown origin, always consider subacute thyroiditis as your differential. So thyroid enlargement may be detected by clinical examination. Patient often do not notice that. Menstrual and obstetric histories are also important. Sometimes it helps in dating of the onset of the disease, and sometimes it helps the plan for further management, particularly in a patient with primary hypothyroidism with goiter. How much dose will give and what will be your TSH target before conception. Like in a patient who wants to become pregnant, in a patient is if she is suffering from Graves' disease and she wants to become pregnant, then your concern is how to choose a certain antithyroid drug, or will you go for radiation ablation if you have a sufficient time before the patient, when the patient is trying to conceive. So these are also very important histories. Compressive symptoms I have already discussed. The two major compressive symptoms you must take history, particularly if the goiter is large, is the history of dysphagia and history of respiratory distress. And please remember, respiratory distress may not often be there if the patient sits up or moves about, but when he or she lies down, there may be dyspnea. And sometimes it may mimic orthopnea to some extent. So be aware, a patient with large goiter with orthopnea-like symptom, please inquire about this. And of course, on examination, if you get stridor, that's an indication of very severe compression. And of course, you need immediate intervention. And of course, there is a long list of histories suggestive of hypo and hyperthyroidism. I think you all know about this. I won't elaborate in this particular lecture. If you're interested in this, this aspect, we can discuss it during Q&A sessions. If you notice proptosis while examining clinically, you have to take some additional histories beyond which I have just discussed. Number one, the history of smoking, because it has been seen that smoking is associated with thyroid-associated orbitopathy. So this is very, very strong association. Duration of proptosis is important. Some symptoms related to proptosis need to be asked, like presence of lacrimation, like grittiness, pain. The pain can be either rest pain or on movements. And usually, if the proptosis is due to thyroid or orbitopathy, it's usually more prominent in the early morning when the patient just wakes up. This is because of accumulation of fluid behind within the retroorbital space. Photophobia and diminished vision are also very important, because photophobia may indicate early corneal ulceration, whereas diminished vision may suggest that there can be dysthyroid optic neuropathy. Both of these are features of severe thyroid eye disease. I will discuss those later on. Now, after this history taking, let's move forward to physical examination. The physical examination of thyroid are divided into various parts. I have divided it into, for the sake of convenience, to general survey, to head-to-foot examination, then the examination of neck, and then the examination of eyes. So I have divided it this way for sake of convenience, but during exam, you can devise your own method. But I think if you go by this way, there is lesser chance that you will miss something. So general survey, when you do, just look at the patient and see whether the patient is very anxious and fidgety. This fidgetiness is very common with any thyrotoxicosis state, be it Graves or otherwise. On the other hand, the severely hypothyroid patient may seem depressed and apathetic. The speech is also important, particularly hypothyroid. You can identify a very characteristic coarse and bit hoarse voice of hypothyroid with a slow, slurred speech. Pallor is a very important sign. It can be there in hypothyroid due to several reasons. This is particularly important for the students to know. You'll be often asked in the examination, in a presence of goiter, what are the causes of pallor? Now, the common causes, there are many rare esoteric causes, but the common causes associated with hypothyroid are, number one, in hypothyroid state, there can be menorrhagia, which can lead to iron deficiency anemia. The autoimmune state like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or even hyperthyroid states like Graves' disease, can have association with pernicious anemia, which leads to vitamin B12 deficiency and megaloblastic anemia. Third, as such, the hypothyroid, be it primary or secondary, can lead to anemia of chronic disease, thereby causing normocytic normochromic anemia, but it can also cause microcytic hypochromic anemia. We have seen some patients of primary hypothyroid with very severe anemia, which uh, is mitigated, which are with a normal iron profile, and which was mitigated with levothyroxine replacement. But please remember, sometimes the apparent pallor can be even more than the degree of anemia itself, that is the degree of deficiency of hemoglobin itself, because there is periorbital puffiness, and this edema can also occur in the subconjunctival space and below the mucous membrane of the eyelids. So if you examine for anemia, the capillaries may be less prominent. So the pallor, the clinical examination of pallor, particularly in the lower eyelids, may be even more than the actual hemoglobin level. Icterus can be there due to jaundice per se, and in a patients with severe hyperthyroid state or thyrotoxic state. And you know, the hepatic dysfunction is one of the feature of thyroid storm. But in severe hypothyroidism, there can be yellowish discoloration of skin, but of course not the sclera. That is due to carotenemia, because you know, in a hypothyroid state, particularly if it is severe, the degradation of beta carotene is impaired, leading to the yellowish tinge of the skin. In Graves' disease, there can be thyroid atropathy, which looks like clubbing with some periosteal changes. And there can be other nail changes like onycholysis, meaning that there can be separation of the nail from the nail bed, or there can be telangiectasia due to hypervascular circulation. Edema can be there. Pitting edema is relatively rare, but many a times we find partially pitting edema, but with a long-standing primary hypothyroidism or secondary hypothyroidism even, we can find non-pitting edema. BMI, of course, is important to document. Pulse is another very important feature, particularly for the students. You will be often asked what are the features of pulse in hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. In hyperthyroidism or thyrotoxicosis, the pulse is usually bounding. It's usually high volume pulse. There is usually tachycardia. The tachycardia can be due to sinus tachycardia or can be due to other forms of supraventricular tachycardia. Atrial fibrillation and the frequent premature atrial contraction are relatively common in elderly individual. In hypothyroid patients, the pulse can be relatively feeble. Regarding blood pressure, again, the hypertension, particularly the diastolic hypertension, is more common in a patient who is hypothyroid, whereas systolic hypertension is more common in a patient who is systolic hypertension is more common in a hyperthyroid state or thyrotoxic state. The pulse pressure is relatively high in thyrotoxicosis, whereas pulse pressure is very narrow in case of hypothyroidism. Now, regarding head to foot examination, there are many things that you should notice, but very briefly, if you want, rapid examination during your short case, just look at the facial appearance. That gives you a lot of clue. And with experience, you can identify a patient with hypothyroid at once. The changes in hair and eyebrow can also be there. Particularly, there is coarsening of hairs. The eyebrows, classically there is loss of eyebrows in the lateral 1/3, but again, that's not very common in our practical clinical experience. Tongue can give you many clues. In a resting state, in a thyrotoxicosis, there can be fasciculation of the tongue, also known as fibrillation of the tongue. Hearing impairment can be there due to rare congenital condition like Pendred's. Hands in a thyrotoxic state can be warm, moist, and erythema. Again, in the exam, you will often ask, how can you differentiate by touching the hand, by feeling the hand, whether it is due to anxiety, the tachycardia and palpitation, whether it is due to anxiety or whether it is due to thyrotoxicosis. Now, the warmth of the hand, the moist warm hand is suggestive of thyrotoxic state, whereas cold and clammy hand is suggestive of anxiety state. There can be features of carpal tunnel syndrome. I won't go into detail, but on examination, in a severe cases, you can see the atrophy of the thenar eminence, and also, as you know, the weakness of the relevant muscles, the abductor, hallucis and others. I won't go into detail of those. Regarding heart, the apical bit, the apex should be localized. There can often be asystria and presence of functional murmurs in case of thyrotoxicosis. There can be mitral valve prolapse, the incidence of which is increased in long-standing thyrotoxicosis. There is a condition you may often ask in the examination, what is means Lehmann scratch. Now, this is a scratchy sound. It's nothing but a pericardial rub, which is not due to pericarditis. It is due to the hyperdynamic state where the forceful contraction of heart leads to these frictional sounds. There are some controversies regarding origin of this sound, but that is, I think, is not that important, and as such is very, very rarely found, but it's important for your examination purpose. Hepatomegaly and splenomegaly can be a feature of thyrotoxicosis. Tremor, particularly the postural tremor, which is very fine type of tremor, can be present in thyrotoxicosis and which can be a presenting feature of thyrotoxicosis. Wasting of muscle as well as proximal myopathy is common in severe thyrotoxic state. In hypothyroidism, there can be pseudo hypertrophy of the muscle that can be present in neonates, which is also known as Debris-Semer-Coquelin syndrome, but again, it's not that important for you. For adults, it comes with the, it's called the Hoffman syndrome. And there can be a very important sign, which is pretty often clinically useful, is called Oltmann sign. This is nothing but the relaxation phase of ankle jerk is delayed. So this is a very important clinical examination in a patient with hypothyroidism. Now, please remember, this is for the PGTs, that when you examine for this sign, do not examine for ankle jerk in the usual way. That is, patient supine is flexed and knees semi-flexed with you pressing below the sole. It's not that way. Ideally, you should make the patient kneel on the bed, or if the patient is standing, you can ask the patient to fold his knee on a tool, and then from behind, you tap on the Achilles tendon. Thereby, you can see the delayed relaxation or slow relaxation after the contraction of the soleus. Skin changes are very important in various thyroid functional status alteration. Generalized blackish discoloration can be seen in a patient with Graves' disease or other causes of long-standing severe thyrotoxicosis. Pretibial myxedema is one of the very important diagnostic feature of Graves' disease, whereas coarse and thick skin is seen in hypothyroid status. It's very important to examine the neck properly in the short case. When we examine the neck, please remember the anatomic position of the neck and the position of the thyroid in the neck. This is the thyroid cartilage, and this one is the cricoid cartilage. The isthmus of the thyroid usually, again, there can be some anatomic variation, but usually it's situated just below the cricoid cartilage in front of second and third tracheal ring. So there lies the isthmus, and the lobes are usually, the lobes are behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So when you examine, particularly when you palpate, please remember to relax the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So how do you relax sternocleidomastoid? I'll come to that later on. Now in inspection, you should do from front and from side. You should examine from front with the neck in normal position and then with extension. Please look for the size, and as you know, the goiter can be classified depending on its size as grade 1A, which is actually not visible but palpable, and uh, a rough estimation of 1A goiter is the size of the one of the lobe is larger than the patient's thumb, the distal phalanx of the patient's thumb, and that is called goiter 1A. Goiter 1B is when the goiter is not visible in the normal position of neck, but it's only visible when the neck is extended. Grade 2 is when the goiter is visible with a normal position of neck. And grade 3 is not often used nowadays, but still if you are asked in the examination, grade 3 is the goiter which is apparent from a certain distance. So it's apparent from, I mean, patients entering the room, the examination room, and you can see the goiter from far. So that's the goiter grade 3. Shape of the goiter is very important, as well as symmetry. Whether there is asymmetric enlargement of one or the other lobe. Is there any apparent nodule on inspection? Is there any scar from any previous surgery? Then you have to ask relevant histories in the short cases. You should ask the patient to swallow and look for the upward movement. Now, those will also appear from MRCP exam. Please remember, when you examine for goiter and ask the patient to swallow, just ask for a bottle or glass of water. It's much easier to keep a small amount of water in the patient's mouth, and when you inspect, when you look at your neck, ask the patient to swallow that water. So that's very important, and it's often said that in MRCP exam, it's a clue if a glass is... Sorry? Okay, there is some background noise, I think. Okay.
You go on.
Okay. So in MRCP exam, it's often said that if there is a glass in the patient's bedside in a very prominent position, then it's a clue that in that station possibly you have to examine for goiter. So this is important. Then if there is a large goiter, you must do a Pemberton's maneuver. What is that? I will show you later on. Now, a few quick pictures of goiter. This is a young child, it's a large goiter. Always think about congenital hypothyroidism, and usually this is due to dyshormonogenesis. So there is impaired production of thyroid hormone, but gland is structurally intact. So due to high TSH level, there is enlargement of goiter. This is something that we come across many a times. This is nothing but a conventional kind of treatment of tattooing the thyroid gland with the hope that it will disappear. The thyroid may not always be located in the utopic or usual position. Sometimes the thyroid can be enlarged even if it is in an ectopic position. So see, in this patient, it's not there in the thyroid bed. This is the thyroid bed the area is talking about. This is in fact over the thyroid cartilage and even above that level, which is depicted by the scintigraphy also. So please look at that. This is a patient with a large goiter where you have to perform the Pemberton's maneuver. And while palpation, I will discuss a very important point, that the get below the swelling. If you cannot get below a thyroid swelling, you must do the Pemberton maneuver as well. So this is a short video. See the face of the patient in the beginning. Just a minute. So see, ask the patient to raise the hand in such a manner that the arms touches the ear, right? And you keep it for 90 seconds if the symptoms doesn't appear. But if the symptoms, see, there is progressive jerkening of the skin with a prominence of veins, and if these things happen, then your Pemberton sign is positive. And ideally, this test should be done in a sitting position, because some patient may feel dizzy after doing this particular maneuver. This is before the test, just at the beginning, and you can see the facial change after the test. There is facial plethora even in such a dark skin individual, it's quite apparent. There is some bit tinge of cyanosis on the lips, and there is prominent of veins in the forehead. So this is a positive Pemberton sign, which indicates retrosternal extension of goiter. This is one of the things when I was a junior teacher in medical college more than 15 years back. I'm in the unit of late professor. I was in the unit of late Professor Amit Banerjee, sir. And he demonstrated to PGTs this particular important sign, that goiter may not always be apparent in a patient who presents with, say, atrial fibrillation. Please remember to examine for goiter even if it's not appear. So it can be hidden by the beard. So you just lift up the beard and that can reveal huge goiter. Now, after inspection, you should do proper palpation. Now, patient should sit comfortably. Neck should be slightly flexed. Most commonly, we palpate from behind, but if you are comfortable enough, you can also palpate from front. But again, in COVID time, possibly it's better to palpate from behind. So it's an additional indication. As I've said, you must remember the anatomic location. The isthmus is situated just below the cricoid. And for the palpation of the individual lobes, you should slightly lateral flex the neck to that side. This is the examination from behind. You keep your thumb on the neck of the neck, and with the fingers you palpate. Then if you say want to palpate the right lobe, you ask the patient, in addition to slight forward bending of the head, he or she should slightly lateral flex and rotate a bit to that side, in this situation the right side, to relax the sternomastoid of right side. And with the left hand, you slightly push the left lobe of thyroid so that the right lobe of thyroid becomes more prominent, and you can palpate for the different parameters more easily. Now, you should look for consistency of the gland. You know, the gland can be very soft in a case of colloid goiter. It can be very hard due to malignancy or Riddle's thyroiditis, and it's usually firm in case of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, but there are some exceptions as well. As for example, in some pure colloid nodules with cyst can feel very hard because of tense fluid collection within the cyst. Nodularity is very, very important because it guides your further management, whether the patient needs ultrasonography or not. And as I've said, the nodule can be single, can be multiple. Please look for tenderness by gentle examination. Getting below the swelling, the importance I have already discussed. The lymph node is a very, very important thing, particularly if the patient, the goiter is nodular. But even if it's diffuse, it's very important to palpate the neck closely, because as I've said, in some situations like thyroid lymphoma, there can be diffuse enlargement of goiter, which although the progression is pretty rapid, in those cases, the lymph node enlargement can be quite prominent. But again, be aware, in many cases, lymph node enlargement may not be there in lymphoma. There can be isolated thyroid lymphoma as well, particularly in the background of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. The lymph node examination in other forms of thyroid cancer is important, of course. Percussion, for a suspected retrosternal goiter, in short cases, you may not get enough time for percussion, but if the examiner asks, do you want to percuss? Then you can say, this is the role of percussion. This is a mediastinal percussion to see the retrosternal extension of goiter. Regarding auscultation, it's a very important clinical sign to us in a thyrotoxic state. In a patient with Graves' disease, which is a hypervascular state of thyroid, there can be audible bruit. So the bruit can help to differentiate between the thyrotoxicosis arising out of Graves from the thyrotoxicosis due to subacute thyroiditis. Now, the last part of the examination, thyroid-related examination, when you get a thyroid enlargement, is the examination of eyes. Now, there are many signs and symptoms associated with various names, but of course, Sujayda will agree that in endocrinology practice, we rarely use those names of those signs and all, but for examination purpose, I've tried to keep some of them as much as possible for the benefit of PGTs, but again, we use those very rarely. But the most important thing is, sorry, just a moment, that when we examine for eye, please look for the signs of thyrotoxicosis per se and the signs which are associated with Graves' orbitopathy. Graves' orbitopathy nowadays also called thyroid associated orbitopathy, because the same condition, the orbitopathy, may not be due to Graves' disease only. It can also be present in some patients with autoimmune hypothyroidism and some patients with euthyroid state. But in those situations also, there is one common factor, that a high level of anti-TSH receptor antibody. So Graves' orbitopathy and thyroid associated orbitopathy are synonymous, but this kind of orbitopathy can present even in a patient who is not thyrotoxic. Now, what are the features of thyrotoxicosis? There can be upper eyelid retraction. This is due to the overactivity of Muller muscles, which, as you know, is innervated by the sympathetic nerves, and there is sympathetic overactivity in any forms of thyrotoxicosis. So this feature can be present in all the forms of thyrotoxicosis. It's also known as Cockles or Dalrymple sign. There can be absence of forehead wrinkling while looking upward with head fixed. Now, this occurs because, again, it is the same reason that there is a overactivity of Muller's muscle. So levator palpebrae superioris need to have less amount of exertion to elevate the eyelid. So thereby, the forehead is also less wrinkled while looking upwards, because Muller's muscle does the work for LPS to some extent. Lid lag can also be there, because again, due to the overactivity of Muller's muscle. The same thing is, lead to globe lag. The lid lag occurs when a person looks down rapidly from upward gaze. So the eyeball moves downwards, but eyelid takes some time. Whereas in globe lag, when a patient looks up suddenly, the eyelid, it moves up pretty rapidly due to overactivity of Muller's muscle, but globe usually lags a bit. Infrequent blinking is also due to the same thing, the overactivity of Muller muscle. So all the eye features of thyrotoxicosis can be present in any form of thyrotoxicosis, not only in Graves', and all of these are due to overactivity of Muller muscle. So this is very practical take home for the PGTs. But more important to us is the clinical features of thyroid associated orbitopathy. When a patient presents with goiter or thyroid enlargement, always look for thyroid associated orbitopathy. It's most easily visible when, most easily can be discerned when the lower sclera is visible when the patient is looking straight forward. Why? Because this is the normal position of the eyelid in most of the patient. Again, please remember, there is some anatomical variation. But this is common in most of the patient without Graves' orbitopathy. Here, as you can see, the lower eyelid, it barely just touches the lower limbus, whereas the upper eyelid, it covers the upper 2 millimeter of cornea from limbus. So this is the normal eye. Now you can well imagine if the lower sclera is visible, it usually indicates forward movement of the globe. So the lower eyelid goes down. So unlike upper eyelid elevation, the lower eyelid retraction is suggestive of Graves' disease or thyroid-associated orbitopathy. But one kind of upper eyelid retraction is important to diagnose thyroid-associated orbitopathy. This is less often discussed, but in molar muscle overactivity, there is uniform upward retraction of the eyelid. But what is lateral flare? If you see this particular eye, as you can see, this is the line when the patient looks at the primary position, in the primary position of eye. If you draw an imaginary line through the pupil, so usually in normal eye, the palpebral aperture is most wide along this line. But in Graves' disease, due to inflammation and fibrosis of the pretarsal fossa, there is retraction in this area. So this is called lateral flare. So you can appreciate that this is the pupillary line and this is the lateral flare. So this sign is very suggestive of thyroid-associated orbitopathy. Nabziger sign is one of the eye signs which you may be asked to demonstrate in your exam. This is nothing but you stand behind the patient. You slightly extend the patient's neck towards you so that the supraorbital and infraorbital prominences are in same line with your eye of vision. Usually the anterior part of cornea, if the patient looks straight in this direction, the anterior part of cornea is usually behind this line, so it's not visible. If the anterior part of cornea is visible beyond this point, then you can see, you can diagnose proptosis. So it's called Nabziger sign. Lagophthalmos is a very important finding, not only for clinical demonstration, but for a very practical purpose. Now, what is lagophthalmos? When the patient tries to close his eyelid very gently, then there is inability of complete closure. Now, what's the importance of this? This leads to exposure of cornea when the patient is sleeping, thereby increases the chance of the corneal ulcer. And corneal ulcer is even more common when there is absence of Bell's phenomenon. Now, Bell's phenomenon is something I think you have all read during your demonstration of Bell's palsy. Now, what is that? The Bell's phenomena, as you know, is a normal feature, but Bell's phenomena is can be easily seen in Bell's palsy because, you know, when you try to close your eyelid, normally your globe moves upwards. This is the normal phenomena. Now, for any reason, if your eye aperture remains open, you can see this phenomena, the upward movement of eyes. In Graves' disease, what happens? Due to the retraction of inferior rectus, in some patients, this Bell's phenomena does not occur. So in addition of lagophthalmos, when the eyelid cannot be closed, if there is lack of Bell's phenomena, what happens? The aperture remains open and your eyeball cannot move away, which increases the chance of corneal ulceration even further. So it's a very important sign for clinical demonstration as well as very practical purpose, because those patients who is having lagophthalmus with absence of Bell's phenomenon are the candidate of special eye protection. Eye movement in different direction is important, and patients should be asked for diplopia in primary gaze as well as in different directions. I will come to the eye movement just after a few slides. Visual acuity should be examined in the bedside if possible. Color vision is also very important, because early loss of perception of red color can be indicative of the dysthyroid optic neuropathy. Fundoscopy is very important because you can demonstrate a papilledema which can be there with a severe increase in retroorbital pressure in thyroid-associated orbitopathy, as well as you can see something called choroidal folds. I will show you one picture. And you have to look for other features of severity and activity. What are those? I will discuss. So regarding the pictures of I was telling about, this is the typical eye of a severe Graves' disease patient. As you can see, the lateral flare I have described. In addition to that, there is periorbital puffiness, there is conjunctival chemosis, there is redness of conjunctiva and periorbital tissue, and there is corneal ulceration. This is the movement. How we'll examine just like your cranial nerve examination. Plus, please remember one important point. Just to give an example, say in this situation, in a lateral position, the patient is unable, when patient looks up, this eye moves up, but not this one. Or if the patient looks, say, towards the right side, this eye moves towards right, but this eye cannot. So in a neurology exam, if you ask that which muscle is at fault, if this eye cannot move laterally, the answer of course would be lateral rectus. Or in a lateral position, this eye cannot move up, it can be due to superior rectus. But please remember, while you are examining a patient of Graves' orbitopathy, this lack of upward movement is not due to the palsy of either inferior oblique or superior rectus. It is due to the thickening and retraction or restraining effect of the inferior rectus. So the lack of upward movement is in a background of Graves' orbitopathy is not due to the palsy of inferior oblique or superior rectus. It is due to retraction of the inferior rectus. Similarly, lack of lateral movement of this indicates that there is traction by medial rectus. It is not due to the palsy of lateral rectus of that side. It is due to the traction effect of medial rectus of that side. Now, sometimes to measure the proptosis objectively, this is not for PDTs, it's not required. We use an instrument, this is just for interest of the clinicians, that's called Hartel's exophthalmometer. With this, we can measure the degree of proptosis. We have one of these in our OPD. I won't go into detail of the principle. This particular instrument uses two mirrors, and from where it's reflected, this is the examiner's eye and this is the patient's eye, and you can see the degree of proptosis here, and the millimeter is marked over here. So you can see how much proptosis is there when this Hartel's ophthalmometer is placed. There are two notches which was placed at the edge of the orbits. So this is a very important instrument for us for objective documentation of the exophthalmos. This is one of the fundoscopic sign I was talking about. This is called choroidal folds. This occurs because the pushing of eyeball from the posterior aspect, that is due to increase in retrobulbar pressure due to severe thyroid associated orbitopathy, and this also necessitates urgent decompression. Now whenever you see you examine a patient with thyroid associated orbitopathy, you should examine for activity and severity. Now what is the difference between activity and severity? The activity means this is the active inflammatory state of the eye in thyroid associated orbitopathy, whereas severity means the degree of incapacitation. So the active state indicates the degree of inflammation, whereas degree of severity indicates the amount of difficulty the patient is facing, particularly in terms of vision and his daily activities. Usually there is a rise in activity which usually precedes the severity, and as you can see, with passage of time the activity can reaches the baseline again, but there can be some residual permanent active features, severe features, even if the activity is no longer there. This is due to the changes, various changes in the retroorbital area, which is mainly due to fibrosis. This is one of the score, we call it clinical activity score, which we often use while clinically examining a thyroid associated orbitopathy. And to us, this is more important than any other sophisticated tests, because those tests like B-mode ultrasound or CT scan or MRI of the orbit can supplement our finding, but our primary decision making depends on the clinical examination of activity. Now, how to remember these 7 points? There are 7 points of CAS, and each point has score of 1. Now, it's very easy if you remember. There are 2 points for pain, there is 3 points for redness, and 2 points for swelling. So the points for pain, the 1 point is a feeling of a pressure behind the globe, and it can occur at rest. If the patient feels pain on moving the eye, this is another score. Regarding the redness of eyelid, redness of conjunctiva, and redness of caruncle or plica, each has 1 point. And regarding swelling, the conjunctival chemosis, the picture I have shown, and inflammatory eye swelling carries 1 point each. So altogether, these 7 points we use for estimation of activity when we see a patient for the first time. Now, in a follow-up, we can use 3 other points, but those are less commonly used because some of those needs more sophisticated instrument. I won't go into detail of those. If there is increase in proptosis of 2 mm or more over the last 3 months, of course, for measure this, you need Hertz exophthalmometer, which I have shown to you. If there is reduction of visual acuity in the same period, or if there is degree of reduction in eye movement, these also constitute the features of activity during follow-up. But this is less important for you, particularly for the students. These 7 points are important. Regarding severity, the most common score that we use, and you'll be often asked in the exam, is the NO-SPEC score. Now, this score, of course, is very important, particularly if you need to remember the what points to examine when you examine a patient with thyroid associated orbitopathy. And this you can find in a textbook as well. There is no physical sign or symptom, is 0. Only sign means some features of thyrotoxicosis, particularly the Muller's muscle overactivity. 2 is the soft tissue involvement, can be absent, minimal, moderate, marked. Soft tissue involvement is mainly demarcated by the periorbital swelling. The fourth point is PEX. The P is proptosis, absent, minimal, moderate, or marked. Extraocular muscle involvement, either it's absent, limitation of movement in extreme, evident restriction of motion, and fixation of glove, where the glove is frozen. It cannot be moved to any direction. Corneal involvement, absent, stripping, ulceration, or clouding, necrosis, and perforation, the case that I have shown, which is a severe corneal involvement. And sight loss due to optic neuropathy is the last point, can be absent, or there can be increasing degree of visual acuity, loss of visual acuity. But please remember, there is some difficulty with the practical application of this no spec score, because see, there can be overlap of some of the features. Number two, some of the gradation, so-called gradation, is not well defined. Like, what is minimal, moderate, or marked soft tissue involvement? What is absent, minimal, or moderate proptosis? What is the evident restriction of motion, and what is limitation of motion in extreme subgauge? So these are not very well documented kind of gradation. So this is relatively less important to us, and we practically do not use it for our daily clinical purpose. But for examination purpose, of course, the students need to remember this so that they do not miss any point while they are examining thyroid-associated orbitopathy in their exam. What we use in our clinical practice is suggested by European group for Graves' orbitopathy, that is UGOGO. That's the Graves' orbitopathy is divided into mild, moderate, and mild, moderate to severe, and vision threatening. These three classes. This is practically very useful. The mild activity is such that the orbitopathy, the severity of orbitopathy does not interfere with the patient's daily life. So it's a mild form. If any of these signs are present, that when there is lid retraction of less than 2 millimeter, when there is mild soft tissue involvement, exophthalmos less than 3 millimeter, there is either transient or no diplopia, and corneal exposure, but there is no corneal ulceration. So the impact of patient's life is minimal. We call it mildly severe. If the lid retraction is more than that, if there is severe or moderate soft tissue involvement, if exophthalmos is more prominent, or there is inconstant or constant diplopia, meaning the diplopia is present in a primary gauge or in different gauges. So we called it moderate to severe when the interference with patient's daily life is so much that it justifies the risks associated with the therapies which constitutes of immunosuppression, mainly IV steroid that we use, or surgical intervention, particularly in inactive disease. Both of these carries quite a risk. So to have a good risk-benefit ratio, we need to demonstrate this degree of severity for a patient to say that this kind of intervention, like immunosuppression, surgical intervention, is justified in these patients. Vision-threatening neuropathy can either be due to dysthyroid optic neuropathy or due to corneal ulcer. But rarely, in a very severe cases, the vision-threatening orbitopathy can also occur due to globe subluxation, severe form of frozen eye, or choroidal folds, as I have shown. And this warrants immediate intervention. Very high dose methylprednisolone pulse and other immunosuppression therapy, or immediate decompression surgery. So this is the severity score, UGOGO score, that you use instead of no spec score. Now we'll rapidly go through few more cases. The goiter, somnolence, constipation in these three sisters all of had onset in the first decade of life. The T4 is low and TSH is very high. Now, if this is present in family members, this always indicates primary congenital hypothyroidism due to dyshormonogenesis, which is an autosomal recessive condition. If the patient presents with palpitation and goiter, the T4, T3 is high, but TSH is low. TSH is normal. So what is this? This can be due to the false elevation of TSH. Again, I won't go into detail of this, but in this particular patient, it's due to possibly due to Graves' orbitopathy. So in this patient, if you find TSH being normal, you look for assay interference. But if it is present in mother as well as daughter, now slight lid retraction along with the goiter and palpitation with normal TSH and high T4 and T3, remember that can be due to thyroid hormone resistance. So the normal T4 with a high free T4 and high T3 can occur in a patient who is having goiter. It can be due to thyroid hormone resistance. But if a patient has a feature of Graves' orbitopathy instead of just lid retraction, then you can think about the TSH assay interference. Now, a single thyroid nodule this patient presented with, and her mother has a history of thyroid surgery. Now, in this kind of situation, always think about the malignancies, particularly the medullary thyroid carcinoma. So the combination of history examination is very, very important. Now, this is a quiz for the postgraduate trainees. Just write in your chat box, what do you think regarding this condition? Just look at the eye. The patient had goiter, although in this picture, the goiter cannot be seen. There is grade 1B goiter. The goiter was visible with extension of neck. Now, in the chat box, the PGTs, please respond. I'll give you just 30 seconds for this. Okay, moving ahead. A single slide regarding workup. Again, this my today's discussion is on clinical evaluation of thyroid. So I won't discuss the details of the workup, but after examination, you must formulate your workup plan. Now, whenever you find a patient with thyroid enlargement, you must always examine for TSH. In almost all of the patients, we also do T4, or in some situations, free T4. And in some patients, particularly where we suspect thyrotoxicosis, T3 can also be done. Scintigraphy, if we nowadays, although it's written in the older textbooks that it's indicated if there is a goiter, nowadays we use it only if TSH is suppressed. If the TSH is normal, we usually do not use scintigraphy. Most commonly used scintigraphy that we use, not the iodine nowadays. Nowadays we use 99M technetium per technetate. So that's the most common scintigraph that we use, but in a patient who have a suppression of TSH. How to interpret that? If you're interested, we can discuss that during Q&A session. Please remember, ultrasound is not indicated in any case with goiter. It's only indicated in a patient who has a palpable thyroid nodule. And nowadays, the USG is so much advanced that scintigraphy is not at all helpful in a euthyroid goiter state. So in all patients who have palpable thyroid nodule, the ultrasound must be done. When there is suspicious cervical lymphadenopathy, always examine for thyroid ultrasound, because you know there is one condition which was initially known as aberrant lateral thyroid. initially it was thought that this is due to the enlargement of the ectopic remnant of thyroid lateral to the thyroid bed. Now, unlike the ectopic thyroid along the path of descent, one of the patients that I have shown you, the lateral presence of a congenital, congenital presence of a thyroid tissue which is lateral to the thyroid bed is very rare. So aberrant lateral thyroid is almost always due to the thyroid cancer, most commonly the papillary thyroid cancer. So in such a patient, in a palpable lymph node, always examine for the thyroid gland. If there is some incidentally detected thyroid lesion by other modalities, like nowadays, pretty often the FDG PET is performed for the evaluation of malignant metastasis or even for FUO, the fever of unknown origin. And during that evaluation, you can find thyroid incidentally detected uptake in the thyroid gland. For us, the USG of thyroid is more important than MRI, CT scan, or even the FDG PET. So we use ultrasound to further characterize these lesions. In a patient who has a high risk of thyroid cancer, even if presents with the diffuse small goiter, particularly those with a history of radiation and family history of thyroid malignancy, the ultrasound should be done, but at what frequency, that is not well defined. In very, very special situation, we ask for thyroglobulin or calcitonin, but those are not usual. The anti-TPO or anti-TG, that is anti-thyroglobulin, is also not routinely performed. But if you are academically inclined to diagnose the Hashimoto's thyroiditis in a patient presenting with goiter, you can test for anti-TPO in that situation, but the use is very limited. So to summarize, the history taking and physical examination should focus on the clinical thyroid status and to identify patients who need further clinical evaluation in the forms of the ultrasonography or other investigations. 3 C's, as I've said, the 3 major concerns of the patient has to be addressed. That is cancer, cosmesis, and compression, along with the functional status. And whenever present, the clinical assessment of thyroid orbitopathy is very important, and you should do judicious investigation depending on your clinical finding. Thank you all for your very patient listening. Thank you. Now I'll hand it over to moderator, Dr. Sujay Ghosh, please.
Thank you, Rana, for an elaborate, extensive, and detailed presentation of clinical approach to thyromegaly. You have highlighted predominantly on history taking, which is probably the most important bit in most of the situations, and clinical examination. Honestly, apart from solitary thyroid nodules, I think in most of the situations we can make a clinical diagnosis.